We are now going to have Carrie Johnson. Oh, to talk about the TJ Working Group.
Good evening, all. By way of introduction, I've lived in Ashton Heights since 1979. I was on the Planning Commission for almost 2 decades. I'm still involved in site plan review and a lot of open space planning, and I'm really allergic to whatever's blowing around out there today. So I apologize in advance for that. This is an outline of what you're going to hear from me in more or less the next 15 minutes. Basically an overview of how the TJ Working Group was created, who was on it, what we did, how far we got. I want to take a detour then into give you some thoughts about, particularly about collaborative processes, which is what we tried to emphasize. And then finally, where we got and where things stand now on a case that is still open, basically. A number of people in this room were involved in the TJ process. Would you all raise your hands if you were? Okay, you guys can take the next 10 minutes off because you know all this already. The rest of you, I will try to run through it fairly quickly. And for details, we do have a really good website full of information, both about APS capacity issues and Thomas Jefferson and a number of other related points, including some really sophisticated traffic studies. So if you want those details, that's where you go for them. Now, the need for more elementary seats in South Arlington has not been a secret for some time. Locations for additional seats had been discussed for a number of years by school board members, by APS staff, by APS advisory committees, and in conversations with county staff. Some of this had become more public than other conversations. However, for whatever reasons, the APS desire to build specifically at Thomas Jefferson and an agreement by the county manager to let that site be considered were not officially announced to the community until middle of May of last year. And a month later, the school board included in its 10-year CIP up to $50,250,000 for a new elementary school with 725 seats, named Jefferson as the preferred site. It also called for a final siting decision by January 31st of this year and stated that if Jefferson was not approved, the alternative would be additions at two South Arlington elementary schools. Those schools were not named at the time. They were identified last fall as Randolph and Barcroft. Now, the reason that this unfolded as it did goes back to the original creation of Thomas Jefferson as a joint middle school and a community center. This was done in the early 70s. Back then, you could still acquire 27 acres in the middle of Arlington, and you could still build a middle school and the huge gym, I'm sure you all know, and the rest of this facility for a combination of county and school bonds of something slightly over $6 million. We'll just let that settle in for a minute. At that time, also, the population of Arlington, as given in a TJ brochure, was 175,000 people. The area was 26 square miles. Your instant quiz is, which of those numbers has not changed? Right, you got it, Bernie, head of the class. Therefore, when the school was built, even though the school is a shared facility, the property was divided, as you see on the map here, with the pink or salmon-colored area in the middle, which is 8.6 acres, controlled by the APS, and the two green areas on either side controlled by the county. The roughly triangular area to the west side, which is mostly made up of parking lot, is about 3.8 acres. The area to the east and that little sliver to the north is 14.7 acres, and that's what's commonly called TJ Park. Now, because of the land division, the county had to give approval for locating a new school here. Because of the lack of notice, because of the resulting community uproar, because of concerns about loss of parkland and all the rest of the issues that bubbled up, the county board in August created the Thomas Jefferson Site Evaluation Working Group and charged it with, as you can see, evaluating the site and making a recommendation about whether or not a school should be built on any part of that site. The charge also called for the group to work collaboratively and to engage in fairly extensive community outreach in a very short time. A preliminary report was due to the board about Thanksgiving, and final report in January in order to enable the board to make its decision in accord with the school's timeline by the end of January of this year. The membership of the group, which was appointed in September, was quite large and diverse, including, as you can see, representatives of all the civic associations around the site, several county advisory commissions, groups such as the Thomas Jefferson PTA and the Facilities Council and the Fair Board. And each of these wound up having several hats. We had members from advisory commissions who were also parents. We had parents in the civic associations who also had expertise in various areas. It was a really dynamic and fully engaged group of people, and I would say that even if some of them weren't here, because it really was a very lively group. In addition, we had encouraged, because of the compressed time frame, we encouraged everybody to choose an alternate, to choose that person at the beginning, to treat them like an understudy, so that the alternate would come and be fully prepared to step in if the member wasn't there. And that worked very well. We had a number of extremely engaged alternates who were also great contributors to the conversations. We had Mary Hines as county board liaison and Emma Violant Sanchez as school board liaison. Both of them came to as many meetings as they could. They commented occasionally, particularly in response to questions about one thing or another. Mostly they listened very intently and very actively and had a lot of informal conversations, and I think helped keep the group pretty well focused on real issues and real possibilities. Now, I would emphasize that our job was not site selection. That had already happened. And the criteria used by APS had, not surprisingly, focused on criteria related to the needs of a new school. Our job was to evaluate this one site that had already been targeted, and specifically to do it not as a blank slate, can you put a school there, but as a property that already had resources and activities and users and programs of enormous value to the community. That framework was partly set forth in the county schools memorandum in 2011, which has been referred to several times here already, which sets up the framework for considering schools' use of county facilities. Those criteria include not only future flexibility of program operation, cost effectiveness, and things like that, but also, and crucially, the ability to continue county services, and I quote this line, at a comparable or greater level. In addition to considering those exercises, we had to look at the impacts of a new elementary school on the middle school, which raised a whole other set of questions about working with students of different ages and buses on different schedules and fields of different sizes for various groups. Now, in all of this, the key factor, again, was that the proposed new use did not get priority over what was already there. The question, and I think it's going to be a key question in everything we consider from now on, is whether and how the elements of that new additional use could fit with what was there without damaging or displacing either community resources or programs. And the county board in its charge to this group brought that home to this site with these site-specific goals. These were set forth in the charge. As you can see, they address not only the usual concerns of neighbors and community members about an intensive use, but also specifically retain part of the park that people were most concerned about because it's natural and therefore not easily replaceable, and no significant loss of green space, no net loss of recreational programming. As you know, this also plays into the wider issues involving other uses of park space, although we tried very hard to keep the dialogue confined, in this case, to this site. So how did we do this? We started with an inventory. And this gives you some images showing, outlining in general where the fields and the courts are. The trees, the county did a tree inventory. There are over 500 trees worth counting, including some very interesting ones. We asked for use figures. We found out that use of the fields had gone up about 30% in the last couple of years. Use of the indoor community center was going up about 8% a year. The county fair last year, 60,000 people came to the county fair, which apparently is a record. We also, there are a lot of these numbers in our final report, which is on the website. But in addition to all the numbers, we also identified things that are somewhat hard to fit into the usual checklist of resources. The community garden, for one, became a very salient element that nobody really wanted to disturb. Another sensitive feature that we hadn't really itemized until we started looking at it was the view into the park from 2nd Street. If you're walking or driving along 2nd Street, you can look, because the land is relatively flat, through the courts, through the trees, into the fields. This gives it a very open edge and a very inviting kind of edge for the neighborhood. And there was enormous view in the group that we didn't want to mess with that. We didn't want to obstruct that by putting a building along 2nd Street. So we spent some time on all of that. We also were given, fairly close to the beginning, 4 concepts that APS was putting forward. And I would emphasize that these are concepts, what they called schemes. These are not at the level of architectural drawings. We were not doing design review. We were looking at building locations, at general massing, at access routes, at parking, at stormwater management issues, at where you would put outdoor facilities related to a school building, such as a playground for little kids. And these 4 were concepts or schemes which were the ones that APS asked us to consider. Now, we didn't just start out by saying, yeah, we like that one, we don't like that one. We let all of this percolate through the community for a little while. We did that in several ways. We had a walking tour to start off. We had another meeting or two to collect this information. Then we had an open house, which was attended by over 130 people and produced a lot of comments, at which all of the boards were up and people could walk around and comment and talk with the transportation consultants about their transportation issues, for example. They came up with a wonderful, huge map with all kinds of annotations on it. And collect information that way. We had a questionnaire at the end. We had comments through the website. A couple of our members took surveys in their neighborhoods on their own initiative and gave us the results. So everybody spent a little time getting a lot of information before we started talking as a group. I would say all those conversations as a group, of course, were public, either in the library or in the Commons at TJ. We basically had very little trouble coming to our first conclusion, which was that the best way to protect the park was to leave it alone. What you see here is the non-TJ Park part of the site highlighted, including both the building and the current west side parking lot. It was relatively easy for the group to focus on the west side location. And if you think back to the APS slides, a location in the far west corner of that site as probably the generally best place to put a new school if there was going to be one. It's not a big site, and so we did emphasize that in order to fit there, you would have to design something that did not displace the parking you needed. The site is pretty well parked as it is, but you don't want to lose any. And that doesn't interfere with the entrances to the middle school and the theater, which, as you know, if you've been there, are on that side of the building. This means that the new school would have to be multi-story, it would have to be fairly compact, and it would have to have structured parking. with either 1 or 2 levels of parking and a green roof on the parking where you could put the dedicated play space for the elementary school. This became important because we didn't want to have elementary school playgrounds, which, as you know, are exclusive to the school during the daytime, displace the playground that is there now that is generally open to the community. There were also issues of proximity and convenience for the elementary school. So all in all, stacking the parking and using that top for new play space made a whole lot of sense. It's not free. It does add to the cost. But we not only felt that it was a good idea in this case, but that it was probably going to become the norm in the future, at least for sites and facilities in the more crowded parts of the county. And that the cost of doing that was less than the cost of buying the equivalent acreage to expand either the park or to find new places to put cars. So it becomes one of the costs of growth, which the county and the taxpayers, we think, are just going to have to absorb. And we got to that point fairly easily with some outstanding issues about traffic, which we addressed a little later. However, if you go back to the charge, you notice that it asked us not whether a new school could fit, but whether it should. You probably have heard that we didn't quite get to consensus on that point. The group was divided as to whether a school should be built now. In line with the collaborative approach to the group, we did not take any votes on anything. And we wound up reporting ourselves as divided. Now, the lack of agreement in part just reflected the differences among members of the group, different perspectives, different priorities. But it also reflected a frustration, which was quite widely shared, about the lack of some information that a lot of members of the group thought was fairly important to decision-making. For example, whether the new school, if it was built, would be a neighborhood school or a choice school. How building at Thomas Jefferson would affect the future of Patrick Henry, which is about half a mile away. I have a map, I forgot to click. TJ is there in the middle, Patrick Henry is in blue. The 2 schools proposed for additions are the yellow ones. And one of the issues that we didn't quite hear enough about was how building at Patrick Henry would relieve pressures at that green dot, which is Oak Ridge, which is the most overcrowded school in South Arlington. It is several miles away. There are lots of scenarios, but nothing, much as we asked, was officially presented to us in a way that made it possible to add this to our analysis. Nor was there any hard information about on-site impacts or neighborhood impacts of the additions at Barcroft and Randolph, other than the comments that various working group members had from their own experience at those schools. All in all, it was impossible to make the kinds of broad evaluations and comparative evaluations that for many of our members